The first agricultural revolution was a centuries-long process of gradual transformation in the way in which we engaged with farming and livestock raising. It turned a system of largely family-based peasant farming into one of capitalists, renters and labourers. From the communal patchwork of the open field system to the rigid, fenced-off plots of private estates. With this revolution, it saw huge gains for landowners, yet its effects were far more mixed for labourers and farmers themselves. Contrary to popular belief, society before the Industrial Revolution was not stagnant in its growth or development. This agricultural revolution was one of 3 proto-industrial revolutions that we'll be looking over in 3 parts to understand this, with a final 4th part culminating in the Industrial Revolution itself and seeing how it developed upon what had previously been built up. We'll first see if we can date how long the agricultural revolution actually lasted, raise questions about whether it was a revolution or not, what it looked like, and tackle the various myths that surround it. It was a revolution that set the foundations for breaking the Malthusian trap, as before, trying to grow more food meant needing more people to grow it in the first place. This revolution allowed for an increase in the amount of food produced, while simultaneously making millions of its own people redundant on the land that it farmed for centuries. This video will be a continuation of the theme of realising how the development of capitalism was far more messy for those who had no choice but to go along with it. I'll particularly be using Robert Allen's 1992 work Enclosure and the Yeomen, the agricultural development of the South Midlands 1450 to 1850 as a main source, with it taking the South Midlands as a focal point case study to really delve into clarifying what all of this probably looked like. With the dating, the original consensus was that it ranged typically from 1750 to 1850. However, historian Eric Kerridge came in to challenge this traditional outlook and said that the revolution started much earlier, between 1560 to 1673, or perhaps extending up to 1767. Allen, as stated already with the title of his book, says that actually the agricultural revolution began to emerge all the way back in the 15th century, with its developments culminating in the change we see by the 17th century. Nowadays, it's generally acknowledged that the revolution happened sometime between the 17th century to the 18th century, with some arguing that change still occurred into the 19th century. Albeit, the 19th century is something I would personally distinguish away from the first agricultural revolution. Largely, by that point, most had settled into the new agricultural system structurally speaking. Regardless, it lasted at least a century or so, with giving some credit to the fact that there could genuinely be effects and elements of this transformation that started much earlier than commonly understood. Overall, it brought great ramifications to existing work practices and lifestyles, having a noticeable impact on techniques as well as on the type of agriculture done, which we will delve into now. To give an overall rundown of what agriculture looked like in the medieval period and heading into early modern England, much of the system consisted of scattered, communally run farms. One example of farming was done often in strips of roughly 1/4 acre each, dispersed across 2 to 4 massive contiguous fields surrounding a village. Typically done in S-shapes, separated only by grass borders or drainage ditches, farmers primarily grew wheat and rye for bread, barley for brewing, and oats for animal feed. This shape was carved by the sheer difficulty of turning a team of heavy oxen at the end of a row. This often was done alongside what was called the fallow system to allow soil to recover its nitrogen levels. It meant a certain amount of the arable land was to be left unplanted, or as fallow, each year for a certain period of time. But of course, it wasn't just cereal products that they grew. Farmers also typically raised livestock that worked as another crucial part of agriculture. An important source of power for being able to plough the crops was done with oxen or with horses, as mentioned earlier, which you had to personally maintain. On top of that, sheep were important, not only for the growing wool trade that characterised the Tudor period, for example, but also used as mobile fertiliser through a process known as sheepfolding. It meant that flocks were pasteurised on these unplanted or fallow fields at night, specifically so their manure would nourish the soil for the next crop to be planted. The social and legal framework was drastically different too. Most small farmers had no legal security in the royal courts and held their land at the will of the lord, according to local custom. It signified that large domains, so the lord's personal land, was often cultivated through coerced labour services. You might have farmed that land because your father did, but legally you existed at the whim of the manor. The only meaningful way that residents could acquire their own personal food and fuel was through common waste, often considered land of the lowest value. Overall, the first and foremost responsibility for farmers was to farm for their village and overall for their landowners at large. Land and produce left over was allowed to be kept for personal use. Productivity was always limited in its capacity to grow. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, wheat typically yielded only about 10 bushels per acre, which was roughly the same as yields in other pre-industrial societies globally. Output could only be increased by adding more land or more labour, which often led to diminishing returns as poor quality soils were brought under the plough. This further meant that livestock densities were relatively low, because there was limited winter fodder during what can be called as the winter bottleneck. Animals typically survived the winter on straw and hay, and some most likely would have been slaughtered preemptively in the autumn, meaning manure was often in short supply too. This was a world of low-level equilibrium. To get more food, you needed more land or more bodies, but expanding into more land was often difficult, and there's only so much of it that you can expand into in the first place. As well as this, more bodies meant more mouths to feed. It was a cycle that held for centuries, but the coming agricultural revolution would help to break this cycle down over time, as well as break down the social fabric of the English village system itself. To understand how, we have to look at the first transformation in the system, the biological and technical revolution. The first phase of the agricultural revolution was characterized by developments and advances made by small-scale family farmers. Allen wrote that, for wheat, the predicted yield rose from 9 bushels in 1550 to 20.6 bushels in 1700. The barley yield increased from 12.2 to 20.7 bushels over the same period. The question then needs to be asked, how did this happen? Firstly, there was the development of new and better quality seeds through the practices of culling and propagating new varieties. One example was a wheat found near Dunstable that was characterized as having yielded 20-for-1. This coincided with a new seed market emerging in the country, which allowed farmers to match specific seed varieties to the soil types where they grew best. It would better spread information about the new wheat variety that I just mentioned. Secondly, there was some kind of growing trend of enclosure, particularly beginning during the Tudor period. But largely, enclosures were not actually characteristic of the revolution at this point in time. Farmers early on still worked within the open field system. It was thanks to technical innovation that things improved significantly, as inventory appraisers increasingly recorded sown grass, which pointed to the progressive expansion and improvement of lay husbandry. So traditionally, land was either permanently arable, ploughed, or permanently pasture, grass. With lay husbandry, it meant rotating these and mixing their use with given land. This is important when, over the centuries, the quality of nitrogen in the soil had declined over time due to the traditional reliance on manure. It was with new nitrogen-capturing crops that it promoted the further integration of livestock and crops, since they were grown as part of an arable rotation, and, whether by accident or design, the increased cultivation of clover added new supplies of nitrogen to the soil, almost kind of like mining the air for fertilizer in a way. Ultimately, these gains benefited those employed rurally the most, an output-expanding movement. As these small farmers and labourers acquired secure copyholds or long-term leases, they were able to keep their gains and maintain their existing employment. They still had to largely rely on either employing more labour or expanding their use of land in order to be able to markedly develop productivity. However, the next phase of the revolution was far less forgiving for those who initially benefited, particularly as landowners saw opportunities with these advances and went ahead with labour-saving methods instead. The second phase of the agricultural revolution was characterized by consolidation and labor shedding. The transition from localized petty bourgeois farming that had grown during the 16th and 17th centuries to during the 18th century and onwards, the rise of large-scale bourgeois agriculture. Capitalism by this point had matured enough with the large-scale colonial extraction and institutional advances that had occurred previously, causing its desire for ever-expanding capital accumulation to begin filtering into this aspect of society more and more, especially as urban areas demanded more and more through ever-increasing population. It was done particularly easily with the development of long-term mortgages, which allowed estates to borrow money to buy out small freeholders and heritable copyholders. Roughly speaking, peasant holdings were less than 60 acres, while larger capitalist estates consolidated into units of more than 100 acres. While historians debate exactly how many subtenants worked these lands, the shift in power was undeniable. A recognisable social hierarchy emerged and cemented itself, consisting of the capitalist landlord who owned the land but delegated management to the level below, the capitalist renter who used this power to rent large blocks of land, and the landless labourer who worked the land itself for wages. To note here too, the landlord was abstracted from the process of farming. They didn't farm themselves and merely provided the permission to use the land and to provide the necessary capital, having the tenants deal with the management more so whilst they reap the benefits. The open field system that had run for centuries was broken apart, shifting from the previously mentioned S-shaped landscaping to compacted, fenced holdings. Enclosure ramped up to its highest peak during the latter phase. Common lands and wastes were taken over by owners with exclusive private control, allowing them to cultivate the land solely for trying to produce as much profit as possible. Collective decision-making was no longer required, something that might have impeded their efforts. Capital-intensive activities such as communal sheepfolding was abandoned to maximise the market value of mutton and wool. Hollow draining on heavy clay soils to solve moisture problems, and Norfolk four-course rotation, so turnips, barley, clover, wheat, on light soils became more common. Though of course this was introduced by the Yeomen initially, just that the landlords made it more standard. It eliminated the fallow year entirely, meaning that 100% of the land was productive 100% of the time, unlike the 1/3 method used in the old system. This meant that, in the end, there was an unparalleled increase in output per worker to avoid the historical limits that plagued agriculture with only so much land and labour that can be applied. Focused on labour shedding techniques, it meant utilising specialisation and work crew system gangs to perform tasks more expeditiously with fewer hands. A former small family farmer, however, was de-skilled to just a mere ploughman or herder. Land use was rationalised according to the comparative advantage of the soil. In the pasture district, landlords converted massive tracts of arable land to permanent grass for fattening cattle and sheep, as this required far less labour and served the growing demand of London. It didn't really take into consideration what local needs might have been. But that begs the question, what was to be done with the excess labour now freed as a result of these actions? The answer to that is that there wasn't really much of an answer. Historians adhering to the agricultural fundamentalist narrative believe that the conglomeration and enclosure was necessary for progress and industrialisation. There was a massive debate regarding this between the Tories and the Marxists, who both agreed with this but disagreed whether employment was retained or expelled respectively. The Marxists were correct in the expulsion of labour, though about this being necessary for the development of society, it may have been so for the system of capitalism itself, but not for most of the people living under it. While productivity growth can aid industry by releasing labour, this only increases GDP if that labour is successfully re-employed. It was in fact not re-employed. Capital per acre, including livestock, actually declined as farm sizes increased. It links back to the previous mentioning of the abstraction of the capitalists from the work itself, as in their efforts to cut back costs, they were implementing lazier forms of agriculture. We've already touched on this, but there was a de-skilling of labour as labourers were no longer employed, a consequence that wouldn't exactly help industrialisation once it came about. Whatever work they might have found made it so that now they only engaged in simple and repetitive labour to a degree far greater than what they would have done if they were still small farmers. Many were left unemployed and relied on the poor law system that existed at this point, the only real form of social welfare available. As Allen puts it, they became paupers, not proletarians. The release of labour was premature, the economy not being able to absorb them, not being ready for it, since modern industrial capitalism was, at the very best, still in its early infancy when looking at the 18th century. A lag of decades where people were just floating about. This had significant ramifications for living standards at this point in time, with those at the very lowest of the economic hierarchy of society bearing the brunt of the negative effects. While real rents increased massively, real wages for labourers remained constant or fell, which I also showed in my previous video, but I'll give a citation for this nonetheless. A core feature of industrialisation, for example, was that it needed continuous reinvestment too. Yet, the wealthy wasted this surplus away on their own personal gains and did not reinvest this back into the economy. They became net borrowers thanks to the advancements in finances and purchased stately homes and elegant living with their fortunes. Creuset 1972 concluded that surprisingly little of the wealth of rural England found its way into the new industrial enterprises. But we also have to ask, who were they borrowing from? Well, that's a little bit of a teaser for the next video. But point being, this lack of investment compounded on the dispelling of labour and not re-employing it, helping to deteriorate domestic markets as labourers had diminished spending power. Wherever the wealthy bought was from whatever hands craftsmen remained, and that was starting to shrink. National income rose by 15% during the earlier phase of the agricultural revolution, yet it stagnated in this later phase. A true paradox in the economy had emerged. If the Yeomen were doing so well, and the landlords were hindering to this degree, why do we still hear that what the latter did was necessary? Mark Overton tries to reconcile this with pointing to issues with Allen's work, such as small sample sizes in the data. He says that trouble with evidence also undermines Allen's recent claim that the Yeoman farming system of 17th century England produced a revolution in corn yields. The suspicion that this might be a rather sweeping generalisation is raised when it is realised that the evidence for this statement is based on yields in part of Oxfordshire. The yield statistics for wheat derive from 28 plots of ground in part of Oxfordshire over a period of 177 years, from 1550 to 1727, with each observation coming from a different plot of land. It may be that the trend of yields in Oxfordshire is correct, but there were undoubtedly regional variations in yield trends. But Allen adduces little evidence as to why this should be the case. You could say that it fails to account for the diverse regional variations in yield trends across England. Yet, there are several things to highlight here. I will personally admit that the sample sizes Allen uses are quite small, but that he did spend a lot of time trying to research looking at over 1,000 villages and putting together various records. It could be that the small sample size is a product of the limited evidence available for the early modern period, especially one stretching over such a period of time as mentioned. Likewise, while the north and west may have held on to family farming longer, for example, as regional variation in the development of capitalism would exist, the South Midlands would have provided the blueprint for the capitalist agriculture that would eventually swallow the whole country. The fact that Allen found any significant yield increases within the open field system raises questions about the necessity of enclosure by the landlords in the first place. Adding further, while 28 plots is a small sample by modern standards, with regards to the use of records themselves, the fact that probate inventories were found and used at all is still useful. Probate inventories provided a rare, empirically grounded window into actual harvest results, distinct from the often optimistic projections found in landlord account books or agrarian treatises. This can be corroborated with other forms of macro evidence in showing that, in spite of the sample, what has been talked about can in fact be shown across the country generally speaking. Following 1672, government corn bounties provided farmers with strong financial incentives to maintain land under tillage, which, for a time, turned England into a net grain exporter. Overton himself states that English agriculture had achieved an export surplus by 1750, in a manner towing the line of the rest of his argument that it wasn't until said century when things actually began to really change for production in agriculture. We see England was already exporting grain before the landlords fully took over, yet there are discrepancies over when said surplus was achieved. One hypothesis to take into consideration both claims could be, one that I at least find plausible, is that during the 17th century, an export surplus was achieved temporarily, but that by the time of the 18th century starting, a brief dip occurred. This could be for a lot of reasons, and not just to do with the landlord's revolution, but that it isn't too far-fetched to assume that it may still have been in effect before levels could have returned by the mid-18th century. I'd recommend further reading with this article by Galfa Lanot and Keith Tribe, Before Political Economy, Debate over Grain Markets, Dearth and Pauperism in England, 1794-96. It does well to discuss the issues of the commodified market for agriculture, the development of political economy analysis, and that, even with the revolution, agriculture was still quite volatile and dangerously vulnerable to weather shocks. Either way, the qualitative evidence, so the probate inventories, supports the quantitative data. Moving to another important piece of criticism. By 1674, about 32% of the land was already enclosed in the South Midlands, and between 1750 to 1850, virtually all that remained was transformed into private land. Fundamentalists erroneously assume that the open field land that was unenclosed was inherently waste, thereby overstating the necessity of enclosure for efficiency. It doesn't realise the difference in the definition for how the land was owned and controlled. It is not what individuals like Shaw Taylor believe, that Allen is somehow contradicting himself with his own dataset. Enclosure was not uniform across the whole country, and in the South Midlands, 55% of the land was still considered as common. But open fields were that 55% mentioned, mostly run by small farmers. Common wasteland, actually being accessible all year round and for the landless, by 1600 was only 4% of the land in the entire country. However, one particular criticism by Shaw Taylor I actually agree with when it comes to Allen is the issue around subtenancy and use of estate surveys and land tax assessments. Considering the length of this video, I won't go into too much depth about this, but the overall point is that with land tax assessments, which Allen uses to try and corroborate his estate surveys, it didn't really become standardized until the late 18th century, and that units of ownership aren't the same as units of farming. It's essentially to help bolster Shaw Taylor's argument in the end that capitalist farming came about much earlier than realised, to which I agree with. This is because I don't agree very much with Allen's emphasis of a peasantry definition for these people, as with what I've already alluded to in this video, a lot of them were practically petty bourgeois and commercial farmers, even if family oriented. That was simply the common form of capitalism at this point. But in the end, the disagreement that we've been laying out so far is not merely just about numbers, but about the source of innovation. Going back to Overton, he assumes he found a paradox by questioning why innovation happened, if not to increase yields, believing that without the structural pressure of enclosure, innovation would be irrational. Yet the landlords were there to minimise costs and maximise profits, something so core to the system of capitalism and to which Overton overlooks. The innovation was used, as mentioned earlier, to shed labour without much of an idea of where it would go at the time. Farms of 50 to 60 acres could be run without much hired labour. However, Shaw Taylor says that, according to the 1851 census, this varied in region, like how the rate of enclosure did too. In Middlesex, a 50 to 74 acre farm employed 4 men, but in Westmoreland, it employed only half a man. But this is where I break from Shaw Taylor again. The high employment seen in 1851 was a later development due to shifts in labour intensity, shifts that should not be projected back into the 17th century. This also makes note of the lack of acknowledgement of the role of female and child labour that it had within the family unit. They were used in roughly equal numbers to men, which was done away with due to the landlord's revolution. This fundamentally changes the labour per acre ratio, further complicating the use of the 1851 census to argue against him. This is important in relation to Shaw Taylor's criticism of Allen using Arthur Young's data, which he believes likely understates labour inputs by recording only permanent staff and ignoring irregular employment. To be fair, it is quite valid, but would be a very hard thing to uncover from the 18th century if trying to challenge claims about labour per acre ratios, and would have to go off assumptions, to my knowledge. Agriculture was forever changing in this country. There's definitely an argument to be made that it was a revolution in its own right, one that spanned well over a century, dismantling a millennia-old system and cycle of food production that was heavily capped by nature. In spite of the production gains acquired, for the people living through it, it was less so of a liberation and more so of an eviction. The Yeomen's revolution proved that we could feed more people without destroying the communities that they lived in. Of course, the landlord's revolution didn't care either way, and it proved far more profitable to destroy it. We were left with a country of paupers, not proletarians, a displaced mass of humanity stripped of their land, their skills and their security, wandering a countryside that no longer needed them. This is an incredibly complex debate. I don't agree with Allen on everything, and historians like Kelly and O'Grada notably challenged his pessimistic views on things like caloric intake and specificities of how bad things were for the landless labourers. But I've focused on Allen today because his work shines a light on a perspective we ignore, that efficiency isn't just a math problem, it's a social one. Whether the calorie count was slightly higher or lower, the structural reality remains, that many were transformed from a class of independent producers into a class of dependent wage earners. The next video in particular links well to asking the next question in this series: did landowners actually have the money to afford this? As stated, borrowing was becoming more of a prevalent behaviour amongst the wealthy. They may have been rich in land, but they needed cash. To understand where that cash came from, we have to look at the financial revolution.